The Gospel according to St. Luke, chapter 10, verses 38 through 42, reads thus. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister named Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." "Martha, Martha," the Lord answered, "you are worried and upset about many things, but only one thing is needed. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." "Put the knife down, ma'am, and step away from the kitchen." By now you would surmise that those would not be the words of a police officer, but probably, as my warped mind goes, it might have been the words of Jesus. And since this is the resumption of our series on call, you probably have a sense of where this message is going to go. And so we ask ourselves, as we have in the previous two installments, what could the reading before us tell us about call? What could Mary and her sister Martha interacting with Jesus, the rabbi, tell us and teach us about call? This is the picture. Jesus, the social animal that he was, is yet again found in a situation, a scenario where there's eating and drinking. Boy, he was a Baptist. And he's in the home of these two famous sisters with their one famous brother. And it's anybody's guess whether this was before the episode with Lazarus or after, but be that as it may, Jesus is invited to this home. And evidently there's a lot of people in the home. He's not the only guest. There are others there, and it's a social event. There's going to be food. And because there's going to be food, there needs to be some preparation. I don't know if Jesus was invited to dinner or not. The suspicion is that he might have been invited to dinner. But you remember one time when he was with his disciples in John chapter 4, and the disciples went away to buy food, and they came back and found him with a woman, talking with her, and they wondered what's going on. And he said, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me." And they wondered, where did he get food from? The suspicion is that even if Jesus was invited for dinner, dinner was the last thing on his mind. You could see it in the text. I mean, if we jump the gun, he's telling Martha at the end, "You're worried about all sorts of things, but the important thing is what Mary has chosen." In other words, forget about the food. What's going on in the living room or whatever the other room was where he was gathered there with the men, and the only woman among them was Mary, there was teaching going on. This was the man cave. Only men allowed. And you see, you should understand by now that when Paul says in his letter to the Corinthians, I would not allow a woman to teach, you can't just lift that out of first century world and dump it in 21st century and say, aha, there, women should keep out of this kind of stuff. Because the reason Paul didn't allow women to teach then was because women weren't allowed to learn then. That is why Martha found that Mary was out of place. She preferred to be where the teaching was going on, sitting at the feet of Jesus. And that created a whole lot of angst in her sister Martha, who thought that she should have been back in the kitchen doing the things that women did and being in the place where women should be. That's the size of this story, leaving out what Jesus' response was for the time being. And in this sermon about call, we could say then that Mary embraced the call. Mary welcomed the call. She welcomed the call by moving to the classroom, as it were. And Martha wrestled against the call by remaining in the kitchen and wanting Mary to come back away from the place to which she was called. I think we can make that case right up front, that Mary welcomed the call while Martha was wrestling against the call. Two actions, one welcoming the call, one wrestling against the call. And let's look at these two sisters one by one. Let's look at Mary first. In welcoming the call, what do we note about Mary? In welcoming the call, Mary does something that is unusual, but it is quite all right, as far as Jesus is concerned at least. It's unusual. That's why it knocked the socks off of her sister Martha. Martha couldn't understand what Mary was up to. And so she tried to call her back to her place. Mary did something that was unusual. It was unusual for the women to push themselves up where the men were. It was unusual for the women to learn. It was unusual for the women to sit at the feet of the rabbi. Only men allowed. That's probably where golf began. Of course, things have changed. Not only did Mary do something that was unusual, she did something that was unpopular. It's a miracle that we don't read not only Martha coming down on Mary, but we don't read that the men all shooed Mary off and said, what are you doing here? Get to the kitchen with your sister. I just think it's a huge miracle we didn't see something like this happen. But we do see the bias in the story I hinted at before. In John 4, when Jesus is at the well with the woman, the disciples marveled, shocked, that he should be standing there talking with this woman and engaging with her. Mary does something that is unusual, but it is right. Mary does something that is unpopular, but it is right. That is the nature of call. And we can therefore say that Mary was outside of the box. Mary was an innovator. Mary was a pioneer. In fact, you wouldn't like this one, but Mary was a liberal, just like Jesus. If this story were real within the last, well, not within, but if this happened, say, about 20, 25 years ago, Mary would be called a feminist, a liberal. If Mary lived in the 1980s, in the southern part of this, well, not in the south anymore, but if she were within a certain denomination close to ours by name, she would have been told, go back home, go back to the kitchen. She would have been silenced. She would have been thrown out. She could have had a PhD and be teaching in the seminary. They would have fired her. And people like us would have benefited from her firing. They would have told her just what Martha was saying. Get your tail back into the kitchen. So from that observation about Mary, here is the first of 4 things I want to leave with you. First, don't idealize conservatism. I am not being political. You're missing the boat if you think I am. Don't idealize conservatism, because even conservatism has its limits. I have absolutely no doubt, but I would put it to you as a question rather than positing it. I wonder if among the wicked things that are at the heart of the several abductions of women and girls, the reason that the female sex far outweighs the male sex of abductees in this nation and all over the world in human trafficking. I wonder if the fly in the ointment among the wicked things is the conservatism that retains this view that women belong in the kitchen and in the bedroom. And when the consequences of their belonging in the kitchen doesn't suit me, I'll slap her upside her head. Because I know someone whose niece was burned to death back in Trinidad because the man didn't like the dish that she cooked. And when the consequences of her place in the bedroom becomes inconvenient, I'll knock her in her guts until she aborts. I wonder if conservatism isn't wreaking havoc among some wicked things. Don't idealize conservatism, because it can rob you of your call if your call is something unusual and if your call is something unpopular. If your call is outside of the box, if your call smacks of liberal, and just because we're conservative, you see, it couldn't be a call. Think, shift yourself if you could out of the 21st back into the 1st century. This was revolutionary. This was a woman out of her place. The text itself bears it out. She was out of order. But she was pursuing a call. Don't idealize conservatism. There's a second thing I will say to you. Based on this episode so far. Don't idealize conservatism, but secondly, don't immobilize those who push the envelope. Don't shut them down. Not just because they're different. Not just because their ideas may be different. Not just because we've never done that this way before. Not just because nobody else does that, so why should we be doing it? Not just because the statistics say so and so means that we must ride with the statistics. Don't immobilize those who push the envelope. Mary pushed the envelope and she was egged on by Jesus. One of the things that made me sense that I was being called 7 years ago to be your pastor was how outside of the box this congregation was. I say was not because I don't think it is anymore. I'm just using the past tense, 7 years ago. But I do want to challenge you and ask, are we as outside of the box as we once used to be? It's a question. And understand in this context that the aspect of call that we're trying to unearth from this text has to do with the willingness to be unusual, to be unpopular, to shatter expectations, and we're getting to that momentarily. In fact, let's go there now. So we've looked at Mary. Mary welcomes the call. And in welcoming the call, she does something unusual, something unpopular, but it's right. It's right because evidently in the text, she is pursuing a call. Jesus said of her, Mary has chosen what is better. And we've warned ourselves, don't idealize conservatism, because even that has its limits. And we've said, secondly, don't immobilize those who push the envelope. Let's move to Martha now. Martha, who is wrestling against the call. Couple of observations about Martha. Number one, straight from the text, Martha is distracted. That's what the text says. Verse 40, but Martha was distracted by what? By all the preparations that had to be made. That had to be made? Says who? She was distracted by expectations. And that's one of the reasons why I said don't idealize conservatism, because conservatism, and funny enough, despite liberalism, sometimes those who are liberal can also slip into the little niche where their expectations, but not as badly as the conservative. The conservative is driven by what is expected, by what is standard, by what is inside the box, by what has always been done, by what is usual, by what is popular. Martha was distracted by expectations. So there are guests in the house. So they're expecting refreshments. So there are preparations that had to be done. Again, I say, says who? Not Jesus. Jesus doesn't care two hoots about it. It's clear in the text. He doesn't care anything about that. And if he doesn't care about it, why should I? So we're getting a little insight already. And here's the third thing I will say to you. We've said, number one, in response to Mary, don't idealize conservatism. We've said, secondly, don't immobilize those who push the envelope. From Martha now, here's the third thing we can say. Don't idolize expectations. We use that word, come to think of it, in Discovery Time this morning, idols. Don't idolize expectations. Why? Because some expectations can deflect call, can deflect us away from a sense of call. I never expect that God would speak through him. He couldn't be speaking to me. I do not expect that God could. I was listening to one of the radio programs, one of the radio stations that I listen to regularly, one of the religious radio stations. And, an innocent comment. The announcer, is telling something about some things that are going on in America. And this is what he says. That God is at work in some places in America. What? Brother, I hope that God is at work in Bellevue, because if he's not at work in Bellevue, I'm toast. God is at work everywhere. Everywhere. Those are the kind, so because certain things are happening in keeping with my expectations, yeah, that's God at work there. And since certain things are not happening in keeping with my expectations, God could not be at work there. Don't idolize expectations, because what you expect can keep you from hearing God's call, especially if it is unusual, especially if it is unpopular, especially if it has never been done before, especially if people are going to shout you down. Don't idolize expectations. So, I still believe, because I see evidence, that in our world today, women should not be paid as much as men. You check to see how many CEOs and how many leaders there are in society, and it is still terribly weighted against women. Women aren't leaders. That's the expectation. Woman has to stay at home. That's an expectation. Woman has to rear her children and not work at the same time outside of the home. That's an expectation. A church has to have a building. That's an expectation. Why did I leave women so fast? A woman can't be an elder. That's an expectation. Worship has to end at 12 noon. I only got 15 minutes, Mike. Hurry up. Expectations which, if we slavishly idolize them and hold to them, they will deflect us from something different, because God is always doing something new and different. Watch that. There's a second thing about Martha. Martha is distracted. And she's distracted by expectations. It's the expectation that these people in the living room need a meal. The expectation that those men aren't going to do it themselves. And the expectation that we women must prepare for it. Martha was distracted by the preparations that had to be made. I marvel that Luke records it like that. So Martha was distracted. But here's the second thing. Evident in the text, Martha was demanding. Martha was demanding. When I read the words that Martha spoke, I can only imagine the tone. And so I imagine, and this is where my sermon title came from, I can imagine that, like Jodi Arias, Martha came out of the kitchen. Jesus, do you not care for me? Tell my sister to get her Fanny out of the living room and back into the kitchen. Well, now that you know that a weapon like this could be concealed under a coat, you'll never look at me the same again while I wear a jacket. But she's demanding. In all of the scriptures, I never see anybody speak to Jesus like this. And it had to be an irate woman. Well, I said that to test you. I didn't see any eyebrows go up. Yeah. Closest to it is, or maybe even exceeding it, is Peter. Go up to Jerusalem, Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and scribes. He'll be mocked, killed, blah, blah, blah. What? That will never happen to you, Lord. Get behind me, Satan. Look, Martha was demanding. Look at the words again. She smokes out of the kitchen straight into Jesus' face. You don't care about me or what? And you see what's going on? She's taking out on poor Jesus what she has against her sister Mary. Think about that. Well, I have to remind myself about that sometimes, that maybe when you're annoyed at me for going past 12, it's not me you're annoyed with, maybe. And so on and so forth. She's demanding. She has her own way. You get a sense that, well, what does the text say? Who invited Jesus? A woman named Martha. Not even Lazarus wore the pants in that house. Martha was the inviter. Martha was in charge of that house. Martha was a control freak. She was demanding. And here's the fourth thing then from the text. Number one, don't idealize conservatism. Number two, don't immobilize those who push the envelope. Number three, don't idolize expectations. Here's number four. Don't imperialize yourself. Don't lift yourself up to be king or queen over anybody. You get this regal sense out of Martha. And she is mistress of all she surveys, and mistress of all. So, if you think you're so autonomous, if you think that you're so big, if you think that you're so brilliant, if you think that you're so individualized and self-made that nobody could tell you what to do, if you think that you're all of that, you're in control of yourself, those are the kinds of things that make people miss the call. There's some dirty words in the Bible, and one of them is submission. It's right there in the Ephesians passage that the Discovery Time class I was in studied this morning. And when the elders and I met a few days ago, I have to tell you this. We made an observation, first about our society, our culture, and a disturbing one about our church. We're not talking about the church now, we're talking about New Life. And this is one of the times when New Life ain't different from any other place, but not because they're like that, we get cut some slack. We feel that we can do some work with submission. I'm not quite sure that was the way that the elders and I viewed it and put it, but I'm in the pulpit, so I have to try to be a diplomat. We have some work to do with submission. We're the body of Christ. And you've heard this from me before, that if my heart decides that it wants to argue with my head, and my head decides it wants to fight back against the heart, and it tells the heart, hey, I've got more brains than you. You can go to hell. Then they're both going to go to hell. Both of them are going to go to the same funeral. And you know, I'm probably the only person in this church who uses that word hell in the way I just used it, so I claim that. But I kid you not, when I listen to the elders and when I experience some of what I experience, sometimes we feel that that's what some people say to us without using the word. Here is Martha. And as far as she is concerned, Jesus and Mary could go to the same place in her anger, in her annoyance. You get what I mean? If you're tripping off on the fact that I used the word hell a while ago, then instead of the focusing on the point that I'm making here, boy, you're really missing it. You're not feeling the angst of Martha. You're not feeling the self-righteousness pouring out of her as she brought that knife, wielding it. It makes Jesus say, put down the knife, ma'am, and step away from the kitchen. I probably should be saying that to you now. Put down the knife that you're probably holding against me for using the word hell. Don't imperialize yourself, because it will create attitudes when you think you're in charge of everybody else. And that's the tightrope that people like pastors and elders have to walk. And as far as I am concerned, I think that the elders, in fact, the elders and pastors of this church err on the side of backing off rather than jumping in and taking charge as the scriptures give us authority to take charge. Because we're not bullies. I've been called a bully once, but it's a tough tightrope, and you can make it easier. When we behave as though we're in charge of everybody or in charge of ourselves and nobody else can break in, we will affect our own call. And guess what? More than that, this is what Martha was guilty of, or could have become guilty of if Mary and Jesus had let her. She would have deflected somebody else from their call. Left Martha alone, Mary would never have learned a thing. Left Martha alone, there would not be this seminal experience that gives us a huge clue into the tremendous value of women in the church, in the world, the tremendous leadership value, the tremendous insight value, the tremendous value overall. Left Martha alone, who wanted to stay in the kitchen, we would not have this. And I put it to you that that is one of the things we have to take from this text. It explodes the myths about a woman's place. And we here in the Midwest need to think about that. So we have to be careful then about intruding on somebody else's call, or worse, deflecting them from it. When we engage in this kind of behavior, several things could happen. Apart from deflecting ourselves or others from their call, we can find ourselves becoming inflexible, unresponsive, overbearing, easily offended when we feel that people aren't doing what they're expected to do, because we have our own little narrow view of what people should be doing. I'm not now talking about when people who are called to call us into challenge and accountability tell us what we ought to be doing. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about those of us who are unwilling to see the big picture. And we might be very busy like Martha was. Very busy. Inviting others to come in. In fact, demanding that others come in. It mightn't be God's call that we're exercising. I want to leave 2 words with you. Apart from those 4 ideas, 4 lessons. First, don't idealize conservatism. It has its limits, and usually God's call is, boy, just something fresh, new we've never seen before. Don't be too conservative. Don't immobilize those who push the envelope. I mean, if a talking jackass isn't pushing the envelope, I don't know what is. Don't idolize expectations. I'm not saying dump all expectations. I mean, it will be a pretty sad world and a pretty undemanding life if you don't have expectations of yourself and of others. But you know what I mean. Don't idolize them. Leave room for what God would do in the unusual. And finally, as I said, don't imperialize yourself. You're not queen or king over yourself or over anybody. But here are 2 words I leave you with. The first word is imagination. And the second word is invitation. Imagination. There are some biblical scholars, and on a spectrum of just sheer research to conspiracy theory. Not all of them are talking about a conspiracy theory. But there are some biblical scholars who truly believe that there weren't only male apostles, and that there were female apostles, and that they couldn't get traction because of the highly paternalistic society in the time of Jesus. That's not too hard to imagine as quite possible, even if you reject it as true. I believe that the approach that Jesus took to women through his whole ministry, if the apostles and if the culture had allowed it then, there'd be a different picture. But guess what? We live in the 21st century in a certain culture. And I don't know where you learn to interpret the Bible. I don't know what your biblical interpretation rules are and so on. But the way I understand the way to interpret the Bible is that it is God's story into which he invites us. That's the second word. Into which he invites us. Not to be onlookers, but to be full participants, full fellow laborers with God. And when I do that, doesn't mean that I must go off and and start saying, well, we are from today making sin outlawed. We can do what we want. No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about engaging in the values and continuing what Jesus said we'd do. You'll do more than these, greater things than these you'll do. Look, I don't think I need to push that anymore because I think I know my audience. The second word is invitation. Invitation. I think that when Jesus put his presence into that house, there was an open invitation to everybody to sit at his feet, including for Mary and Martha. That's what I believe was at the heart of Jesus' answer. Martha, Martha. Now, you don't hear Jesus saying, okay, I'm in the house now, everybody come gather around, sit at my feet, the rabbi is in. You don't have to say that for an invitation. But given who he was, there was inherent in him, in his presence, an invitation for all to sit and learn. That's why he said to Martha, Martha, you're worried. You're worried about all sorts of inconsequential things. But watch your sister Mary. She has chosen the better thing. One thing is needed. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away. And it will not be taken away from her. That's one of the clues on which those scholars who believe that Mary was intended to be an apostle, that same Mary who was the first among two women to see and witness the resurrected Lord. Look, it's loaded, and the time is gone. But here's the point. If you could use your imagination, remember we began this series? We began this series looking at a woman named Rahab. And we said that if a woman could be called, anybody could be called. If a prostitute could be called, anybody could be called. If a woman who wasn't even a Hebrew could be called, anybody could be called. So in that same vein, I'm coming back to say, if a woman who should have stepped back into the kitchen and picked up the knife could be called to sit at the feet of Jesus and blow apart, shatter the glass ceiling then what would your imagination linked to the Holy Spirit tell you? God could be calling you, and God could be calling us, and God could be calling New Life Baptist Church to be and do. And before you finish that thought, what if the imagination isn't only an imagination, but an invitation. The hymn that we're going to sing next is a control freak's nightmare. Have thine own way, Lord. Get me out of here. Have thine own way. Thou, you are the potter. I am the clay. That hymn writer, I think it's a woman. You see the hymn writer there? It is a woman. Only a woman could come up with that brilliance. You see what she does? Clay, dirt, from which we were originally fashioned. So when we begin to behave as though, look, I am queen of this kitchen, or I am king of this pulpit, or I am lord of this music, or I am... Step away. Don't come near my thing. When we begin to behave like that, God laughs. That's Psalm 2. He who sits in the heavens shall laugh. Why do heathens rage and the people imagine a vain thing? Psalm 2. God laughs because we're fashioned out of clay. And this hymn reminds us of what the heart of call is, to come back to being putty in God's hands. Are you willing to be that? Is our church willing? Look, a whole lot of people are absent today, and very often I found in my ministry that I'm preaching both to those present and those absent. I don't think church people catch this, that they're responsible for sharing with those who are absent what they heard. Because this isn't written to some people in the faith. This is written for all of us. And if some of us should be among the rest who should be exercising this, and some are absent, the thing is going to be weak. A house divided against itself will fall. You have a responsibility to call all new lifers who are absent today to the vision that this message brings. That God is calling this church, has always been calling this church, to something unusual, to something maybe even unpopular, to something that demands that we drop our conservatism. Again, I'm not talking politically. To stop muzzling oxen while they tread, immobilizing outside of the box, envelope pushers. I think I've said enough. And for now, you're left with your imagination and the Spirit and an invitation. Let's stand and commit.